Sometime in late 1909 or early 1910, Agnes Sloane Nibley and her husband, Alexander Nibley, traveled from their home in Portland, Oregon to visit relatives in Salt Lake City. Agnes was in the middle of a difficult pregnancy and went to an endowment session in the Salt Lake Temple to seek some spiritual peace and physical comfort. There she met an old friend, John R. Winder, who was then serving both as temple president and as first counselor to church president Joseph F. Smith. The revered 88-year-old leader, venerable with glossy white hair and a flowing white beard, smiled at Sister Nibley. His eyes twinkled behind his wire spectacles. "Sister Nibley," he asked, "may I give you a blessing?" Naturally, Agnes consented. President Winder led her into an adjoining room and laid his hands on her head. As he spoke, he not only gave Sister Nibley a blessing of comfort, but also spoke prophetically about the son Sister Nibley would soon deliver, stating that he would accomplish an important work for the church. A few months later, President Winder died in Salt Lake City on the 27th of March, 1910. On his deathbed, he asked whether Sister Nibley had yet given birth. On that very same day, over 700 miles away in Portland, Agnes Sloane Nibley gave birth to her son. The parents named him Hugh for his maternal grandfather, but in honor of President Winder, also gave him the middle name of Winder. Hugh Winder Nibley. Hugh's father, Alexander Nibley, the second son of Charles W. Nibley, was 33 years old when his son was born, and Agnes was 24. Al, as he was known to family and friends, was only 1 year old when his father, Charles W., left on his mission to Europe. He was 3 when his father returned. 1 year later, his father took another wife, and then his time was divided between the two families. Years later, when Charles Nibley took a third wife, there were 3 families to provide for. As the anti-polygamy crusades heated up and his father's business interests grew, Al saw less and less of Charles. Most likely, the relationship between Charles and Al was much like that described by Al's brother Nathan in a letter he wrote to their father in 1925. "I believe that you could have helped me greatly with criticism, counsel, and advice, but for some reason you have never counseled with me or even had a good heart-to-heart talk. I have regretted the fact that you and I have never been closer to each other, but then I have received so much from you in the way of example that I don't want you, dear Father, to think for 1 minute that I don't love and revere you a great deal, for I do. In fact, I am very proud of you, and it affords me much satisfaction to be known as your son." Al's father, Charles Nibley, was thus always an absent presence in the family. His influence was felt, but he was rarely seen. Al saw his father try to compensate for his absence at home by giving his family as much monetary help as he could. The children were well provided for, even spoiled and showered with gifts every time their father came to visit. The public esteem in which Charles W. Nibley was held may have further compensated Al for his lack of personal attention. Al wrote his father in 1918, "I have found all along, for many years, that the name Nibley is held in honor by the big men of the land whenever it is known. To me, it has always been a magic password gaining admission for me to the offices of some very big and good men." But that name was as much a burden as blessing. Charles's successes in business and in the church were difficult to live up to, although Al tried desperately to do so. Eventually, Charles involved all his sons in his various business interests or launched them into businesses of their own. Charles had a great deal of faith in L's talents and abilities and eventually put him in charge of several of his most promising but demanding business ventures. L attended Brigham Young College and Utah State Agricultural College in Logan, then moved to Baker, Oregon in 1893, where he wrote as a clerk and later as a manager of the Oregon Lumber Company store maintained for the logging camps. In 1898, when he was 21, he left on a 3-year mission to Holland. He returned to La Grande, Oregon in 1901 and became assistant chemist in another of his father's companies, Amalgamated Sugar. The next year, on 17th of June 1902, he married Constance Thatcher, a niece of Apostle Moses Thatcher and a granddaughter of Brigham Young. In early 1905, Constance died while giving birth to their first child. The baby, Connie, survived and was raised, as was the custom, by her mother's family. Almost immediately after his wife's death, L accepted another mission call as a sort of distractive therapy and left for Holland and Belgium in June. Here he served as president of the Liege Conference District. In the summer of 1906, when his father and Joseph F. Smith visited Europe, L accompanied them on their tour. Before they left Europe, they set him apart as president of the Netherlands-Belgium mission, a position he served for only a few months, thanks to another significant event that occurred during this tour. In Berlin, the party met Agnes Sloane, who was there studying piano. Little is known about their courtship, but the two fell in love, and Agnes accompanied L's father and President Smith back to Utah to prepare for her wedding. Upon his return, L and Agnes were sealed in the Salt Lake Temple on the 27th of June 1907 by Joseph F. Smith. Agnes was 21, and L was 31. Agnes Sloane, known to friends and family as Sloaney, was the oldest daughter of Hugh Russell Sloane's and Margaret Violet Reed Sloane's 11 children. She was born on the 17th of October, 1885, in Manti, Utah, but grew up in Cardston, Alberta, Canada, where the family moved in 1896. Sloaney was a gifted musician. After 3 years of study in Salt Lake City, she had come to continue her studies in Berlin in 1905 and had been there about a year when she and Alexander Nibley met. L was easygoing, quick-witted, and handsome. It was surely a bond that L played the oboe and also the piano, but Sloaney was most likely equally impressed with his family's prestigious name and wealth. As a young woman from the wheat fields of Canada, Sloaney must have seen that L was marked for a life of culture, taste, and wealth. Marriage to him would surely keep her from having to return to the farm. Following their marriage in 1907, the couple moved to Portland, Oregon, where L took over the duties of directing his father's 18-year-old lumber business. In 1899, David Eccles and Charles W. Nibley had entered into a partnership to create the Oregon Lumber Company, which was centered in Bank City and the Sumter Valley. The combination of the smooth-talking Nibley and careful managing Eccles, as one historian has written, established the organization which made both of them multimillionaires. As the company grew, the directors deliberately gave hiring preferences to Mormons. So many Mormon families moved to Utah to work for the company that the LDS Church soon became one of the most prominent. Mormon families moved to Utah to work for the company that the LDS Church soon became one of the most prominent religions in Eastern Oregon. So many Mormon families moved from Utah to work for the company that the LDS Church soon became one of the most prominent religions in Eastern Oregon. The company continued to expand, building sawmills in West Oregon at Hood River and Chenoweth. In 1907, the year of Al's and Sloane's marriage, Charles Nibley moved to Salt Lake City as the church's presiding bishop. The timing was thus perfect for the newly married Al to take over his father's duties in West Oregon. A biographical sketch of Al, written in 1946, charts some additional points in his career. Although showing considerable vagueness on dates, he assisted in promotion of a Portland cement company at Oswego, Oregon, and was also appointed resident manager of the Amalgamated Sugar Company at Grant Pass, Oregon in 1917. Al and Sloane had a great deal of fun together as one of Portland's young and affluent couples, moving so easily within this elite circle that they could also poke fun at it. At one very formal party in the early 1920s, all the guests duly congregated at the Nibley home, only to find themselves without hosts. While the guests were milling about wondering what was going on, they noticed a couple of tramps wandering about in the yard. Suddenly, the tramps came right in through the French windows and entered the living room. As everyone stood looking astonished and feeling horribly uncomfortable, they suddenly realized that the tramps were Al and Sloane. While Sloane was eager to begin a family, she wanted nothing to do with Al's 2-year-old daughter, Connie. Sloane loathed polygamy, and even though Al was legally a widow, because of his temple sealing to Constance, Sloane was technically the second wife in a plural relationship that would become operational in the next life. Connie never lived with the family, and Sloane insisted that if her own children spoke of Connie, they referred to her as a cousin rather than a sister. In fact, Hugh's sister Barbara stated that she never knew she had a half-sister until she was 15. Sloane gave birth to her first child, Alexander Sloane, on the 23rd of June, 1908. Sloane, as they called him, was fat, healthy, and beautiful with blonde curly hair. Sloane let it grow into long, almost girlish ringlets. When Sloane was almost 2, Hugh was born. As Halley's Comet glittered in the night sky in early spring 1910, the 46 states of America were only 10 years into a new century full of hope and prosperity. Mark Twain, Leo Tolstoy, and William James all died that year. The Model T Ford had been coming off the assembly line for a year. It was the era of the progressives, with William Howard Taft, the acknowledged successor of popular Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, as President of the United States. There was likely no place more prosperous or helpful in 1910 than Portland, Oregon. Employment was keeping pace with a population that was growing by almost 20,000 each year. Between 1905 and 1910, a building boom had raised the value of new building permits by 400%, and the volume of banking transactions increased by 150%. The Portland Oregonian of the 25th of September 1910 exclaimed, "Prosperity everywhere apparent and no cloud on the horizon." Hugh was born into a family that fully enjoyed this prosperous period. Though not ostentatiously, they lived comfortably. Hugh was an extremely curious child from the start. Even as a toddler, he had, as he later put it, an abiding conviction that there were things of transcendent import awaiting my attention. So I kept wandering away from where I was supposed to be. One of his earliest memories is of running away from home at age 3. I was determined I was determined. I just had to run away. I had to find out what was up there. There would be a rainbow near Mount Hood or something, and I would just ache to know what was up there. No doubt this precocity was very troubling to Hugh's young parents. As Hugh offhandedly acknowledged, adults find that attitude upsetting. Early on, Hugh also exhibited an interest in exotic languages. The carpet in the family's living room was a beautiful hand-loomed rug that Elle had bought for Sloane on the day Hugh was born. In one corner of the rug, the weaver's name appeared in Arabic script as part of the design. Even as a toddler, little Hugh was fascinated with the script and spent many hours studying the curving letters. Hugh was precocious in other ways. Too. He learned to read before he went to school, his first book being The Fate of a Squash Pie. It was a sad book, remembers Hugh, because the protagonist took the squash pie to bed with her. I remember the steel engraving of the little girl coming down the stairs with a squash pie under her arm, but it taught me what to do if you have a squash pie. Despite his intellectual bent, Hugh's first experience with school was traumatizing. On his first day of school, his mother sent him with the milkman, trusting that he would arrive safely. The milk wagon, drawn by an old slow horse, meandered along, making deliveries, and by the time they got to school, young Hugh was quite late. Then I saw Mr. Brown, the principal, Hugh remembers, looking at me out the window from way up there, and he called to me, thinking he was in trouble. Hugh ran home as fast as he could, the principal running right behind. Mother was on the porch sitting in her hammock, and I flung myself at her and clung for dear life. At school, Hugh was quick to learn, but also quiet. It wasn't until the end of the first term that the teacher found out that he could read. As Hugh recalls, we were reading the clown book. It was the hardest of them all. No one could do it, so I raised my hand and rattled it off. "Why, Hugh, you didn't tell me you could read." "Well, you didn't ask," Hugh replied. Sloane and Elle were devoted parents, but had very different ways of relating to their children. In parenting styles, they had much in common with Elle's grandparents, James and Jean Nibley. Like James, Elle was light-hearted and witty. Like Jean, Sloane was stern and businesslike. Hugh's brother Reed later recalled that Dad was very casual and very loving and very warm. Sloane confirmed that his father was easygoing, a lot of fun. He was a very gregarious person. Everybody liked him. Elle doted on his children. Every night, Hugh recalls, he read to us from the complete works of Mark Twain. Elle never took anything too seriously, which gave the children emotional security and stability. An incident illustrating Elle's playful sense of humor occurred during his second mission to Holland, while Apostle Heber J. Grant was serving as president of the European Mission. They toured the various missions together, speaking at district conferences of members and missionaries. Grant frequently spoke on one of his favorite topics, the importance of setting goals and working to achieve them. He gave as one example his own ability to learn how to sing after being born tone deaf. His voice, he reported, had caused some to say that hearing him sing sounded like somebody was having his teeth pulled. Undeterred by his impairment, Grant worked and worked, singing the same line of the song over and over, imitating his voice teacher as best he could. Eventually, he learned to sing several hymns. As he stated, "It required a vast amount of practice to learn, and my first hymn was sung many hundreds of times before I succeeded in getting it right." To prove that he had mastered the talent, Grant would then sing for the saints, accompanied by Elle on the piano. Hugh recalls his father saying that Grant preferred sentimental old songs like "The Flag Without a Stain" and "I Have Dreamed of a Beautiful City." Over the course of the tour, Grant sang these songs to Dad 600 or 700 times, Hugh recalls. Oh, it would drive you crazy as it did him, because his singing was not very good. So Elle took advantage of Grant's tone deafness and began to play the accompaniment one half step off, slyly smiling as the congregation tried to contain its laughter. As Hugh stated, "You had to hear Grant sing when Dad played, though. It was absolutely horrifying." Sloane, in contrast, was very serious and quite moody. "Mother had a great deal of love for her children," Reed stated, "but she was so stern. She was the manager, and she really ran that place, so we didn't get the same sort of warm feeling that we got from Dad." Sloane was also temperamental. She used to have moods where she'd run around cracking heads, Sloane confided. She'd go through the house imitating a Tasmanian devil once in a while. Everybody would hide in the storm cellar. Daughter Barbara later recalled, "She was just the most charming person to people outside the family, and just a tyrant to the people in the family. I think of Taming of the Shrew, but she was never tamed." One of Hugh's earliest memories dates from about 1914. "I remember the day World War I broke out." Hugh would later recall, "I was only 4 years old, but I remember it vividly. My father coming in and reporting. By the time the United States finally entered the war in 1970, Hugh was playing soldier in the muddy lots behind his house." Hugh's father fully supported the United States entry into the war and wanted to enlist. Ineligible because he was over 40 and had a family, he actively sought some way to contribute to the war effort, finally using his father's influence to land a job with the War Industries Board. Two people had a great influence on Hugh at this time: his grandmother Sloane and his grandfather Nibley. Margaret Violet Reed Sloane had been born to Irish parents, John Patrick Reed and Margaret Kirkwood Reed, on the 16th of April, 1857, in Edinburgh, Scotland. It was in Scotland that her parents had joined the Mormon Church 10 years earlier, so Margaret was raised in a zealous Mormon home. Soon after Margaret's birth, the family moved back to Belfast, where Margaret spent most of her youth. In 1862, Margaret's brother William Kirkwood Reed and John Kirkwood Reed immigrated to Utah with their uncle, William Taylor Reed. Her father followed in 1871, and a year later, 15-year-old Margaret traveled with her mother and siblings to be reunited with her father and older brothers in Utah. Margaret never had any desire to return to the land of her birth. Her only memories of Ireland were vivid nightmares of the fighting and bloodshed between the British and Irish during the Fenian Uprising. The family eventually settled in Manti, where Margaret was a very popular young lady. At age 21, she married Irish-born Hugh Russell Sloane on the 27th of September, 1878. Although he had lived in Utah for several years, Hugh Sloane was not a member of the church when the couple married. Margaret's parents initially opposed the match. Several years after they were married, Margaret became deathly ill and called for the elders to administer to her. When she was miraculously healed, Hugh Sloane was so impressed that he joined the church in 1882 and became deeply devout. The couple moved from town to town in Utah, where Hugh found work as an artisan. They lived in Manti during the construction of the Manti Temple, and Hugh worked on its decoration and trim. Eventually, at the urging of Apostle John W. Taylor, the family moved to Cardston, Alberta, Canada. The couple had 11 children, 7 of whom survived to adulthood. In 1907, following her daughter Sloanie's marriage, Grandma Sloane's health began to deteriorate. She came down from Canada to visit Sloanie in Oregon and felt so much better that she, her husband, and youngest son, Edgar Lloyd, moved to Portland in 1909 and lived there for about 5 years. Around 1914, they moved to Salt Lake City, and in 1960, they moved back to Canada. During the time the Sloanes lived in Portland, Hugh spent many hours with his grandmother, both as a toddler and later on her lengthy, frequent visits. They became very close. Grandma Sloane was known as a very charitable and practical person with a great sense of humor. She was a dynamo, remembers Hugh, and always helping people. She was never so happy as when there was a family sick somewhere. During the flu epidemic in 1918, Grandma Sloane traveled from house to house nursing the people in Cardston back to health. Despite her assiduous attention to and genuine concern, her patients were not always grateful. She created Grandma's Oil, a concoction based on a recipe she got from a Chinese doctor in Portland. From a very small bottle, she would pour a drop on the patient's back or chest and cover the spot with cotton. It was obviously some kind of caustic, since in a few days little pockets formed that itched intolerably and drained pus. This, she believed, drew impurities from the body. When Grandma was at your house, you never dared cough in the night, recalled Hugh, or she'd swoop down on you with that damnable medicine. Even though Grandma Sloane had her own residence in Portland, she spent many hours with Sloanie's children. She practically raised them. It is unclear how Sloanie felt about her mother's constant presence in her home, but after her third son, Fred Richard, was born on the 29th of April 1913, Sloanie was probably grateful for the assistance in raising 3 boys. Hugh certainly benefited from the time he spent with his grandmother. His love and veneration for her grew deep. Many years later, in a birthday greeting to his grandmother, Hugh wrote that she was someone who lived both wisely and well, and he confessed, "We all love you, and something more. It is wonderful, and it is wonder and veneration on my part. I wish I could become such a person." In another letter to his grandmother, he wrote warmly, "There is nothing about you I don't envy. I know of but one person who is just what we shall all be, whose soul from the beginning was as clear and noble and magnanimous as my kind can hope to be only after endless years of painful discipline and ceaseless correction." Clearly, through her visits throughout Hugh's youth, Grandma Sloane kept a very special place in his life. Part of what made Grandma Sloane so special to Hugh was her discussion of religion. She impressively related prophecies to the children, in particular those of Eliza R. Snow. She frequently reminded the boys that they were living in the last days. In this, Grandma Sloane was being strictly orthodox, as Hugh explains. In her day, everybody talked about it. It was an important part of our doctrine that these are the last days. This apocalyptic discussion affected young Hugh, especially in light of the changing shape of Portland during the 1910s. Portland was both submerged in nature and also witnessing its wholesale destruction. Hugh later described the people living in Portland as most conservative and most nature-minded. People loved nature and because of the great woods, they wanted to live in it. But the 1910s were a time of great development, and with development came deforestation. Hugh's grandfather's Oregon Lumber Company, the biggest lumber company in the world until Weyerhaeuser came along, was clearing timber to create railroad ties. I recall how often my grandmother used to say, and we firmly believed it as children. Hugh would later write, "It is a sin to kill a fly, much more to harm a greater thing." Hugh's grandmother's abiding respect for life and belief that its destruction was sinful affected Hugh deeply. "What she told me I believed," stated Hugh, "and I never had occasion to give it up, because it was never exposed as false later on." While she most likely never specifically criticized Charles W. Nibley's lumber company for its destruction of the Oregon forests, Grandma Sloane's words were a striking contrast to Grandpa Nibley's behavior. Nevertheless, Hugh was very close to his Grandpa Nibley. When Charles W. Nibley stopped by the house in Portland, life became jolly. This man, who had been distant and remote with his own children, would always get down on the floor with his grandchildren, romp with them, and play very undignified games. Charles's love of literature was profound, especially of Burns and Shakespeare, and he would spend many hours discussing poetry and plays with the youthful Hugh. Charles always urged Hugh not to get involved in business. "Hit the Shakespeare, hit the astronomy, and forget the business," recommended this man, who was probably one of Mormondom's most consummate businessmen. Frequently accompanying Charles Nibley to Oregon were equally notable men. President Joseph F. Smith greatly impressed young Hugh, who admired his trait of being neither subservient nor looking down on anyone. This church president, in a town where Mormons were not a majority, would get up at 3 a.m. in the morning and go down to the lower part of town. If some poor old bum had been picked up by the police station, he would come down to try to help him out. He put himself out all the time, and nobody knew about it. On one occasion, when there was illness in a ward member's family, President Smith sat up with him and his little girl all night. He let the business go and everything else. That little sick child and sitting with Brother Westengard were more important to him. In early 1970, when Hugh turned 7, the family, except for Grandma Sloane, moved to Medford, Oregon, so Al could manage his father's sugar company. The year before, Charles Nibley, who was a member of the board of directors in the Oregon-Utah Sugar Company, had financed the construction of a sugar beet processing factory as Grants Pass in southwest Oregon's Rue River Valley. Another sugar factory was planned for Medford, provided farmers could guarantee 5,000 acres of sugar beets in 1917 and 6,000 acres in 1918. Production never reached these goals, and by 1919, the company decided to build in the Yakima Valley instead. Soon after the family reached Medford, Philip Gordon was born on the 25th of July, 1917, Sony's 4th child in 9 years. The family's prosperity continued. Al was a skilled manager and handled his father's business interests efficiently. On his 8th birthday, the 27th of March, 1918, Hugh was baptized a member of the church in Jackson Hot Springs, halfway between Medford and Ashland, Oregon. Hugh remembers that the day was chilly and rainy, but the steaming water registered a scorching 108 degrees. It was just like a visit to Hades to get baptized, he remarked candidly. When the sugar beet industry folded in Medford in 1919, the family returned to Portland, where Al continued to represent his father's sugar interests. In the 1920 census, Al listed his occupation as purchasing agent for a sugar company. Sloan was now 11, Hugh was 9, Richard was 6, and Philip was 2. Hugh enrolled in the 4th grade at Irvington Elementary School. It was obvious to everyone that Hugh was very bright, but no one knew how bright until a new principal, Mr. Barr, was hired. He had been teaching at Columbia University, where he had become a disciple of the influential educator John Dewey, who stressed a pragmatic approach. Intent on reforming the school, Barr administered the Bennett IQ test to all of the students. After seeing Hugh score, Barr called him in and told him, "Look, if you would go to sleep for 9 years and wake up, you'd still know far more than any of the students in this school." So for the remainder of their time in Portland, Barr privately tutored him. "I didn't go to school," remembers Hugh with some complacency. "The principal came and tutored me at home. We had some nice times together." Al and Sloan allowed Hugh great latitude in the educational arrangement. He spent a great deal of time exploring the woods and riding his bicycle about town. "I would always stop on the Broadway Bridge and look down the river," mused Hugh, "as far as you could see, where the mass of ships, 3 masters, 4 masters. The 3 masters were the common ones." Hugh was a very capable artist by age 10 and enjoyed sketching the ships and making models out of balsa wood. Hugh also found exciting the moments when the steam engines pulled out of the station, which was located next to the waterfront. Hugh's parents supplemented their children's education with all kinds of lessons and tutors. "We had tutors for everything," remembers Sloan. "We had a music teacher that came by every day. The piano teacher was a strict old-style instructor named Emma B. Carroll. She was hell on wheels," remembers Hugh. "You'd get one note wrong and she'd say, 'That's the most hell-be-damned thing I ever heard.'" A Miss Binney instructed the boys in French, giving 9-year-old Hugh a head start on his languages. All the boys slept in the nursery, heated by an open fireplace, watching the shadows dance on the ceiling until they fell asleep. To amuse themselves after bedtime, Sloan and Hugh would tell stories which they made up as they went along. They usually involved somehow or other falling off the steel bridge into the Willamette River, remembered Sloan. They were pretty slapstick. On the 16th of January, 1921, the family moved to Southern California. Elle was having health problems and believed that the move would help. Charles Nibley had business interests in California that required attention, so the move was doubly convenient. As the family boarded the train for California, 10-year-old Hugh could hear the chainsaws roaring. For the forests, the end was near, but for Hugh, it was another beginning.